On guitar. My name is David Akers. Thank you. We're gonna do a lot, well, just a little actually. We got just a little for you today, but please enjoy the book once you've got it in your hands. I'm sure you won't be able to put it down. It's all about you, street. You can almost feel the beat. Oh, Northwest DC. You know, thank you. I've got a friend who just bought one of those new condos on U Street. He had just lost his lady, they broke up. It doesn't matter why, who was wrong or whatever. He left this lady and he bought this fancy condo. And one morning he's looking out his window and he sees this incredibly beautiful woman walk by. Ah, she was fascinatingly lovely. He was stunned by her style, her walk, her mannerisms, everything about her just took him away. Well, the next morning he got up, it was around 7:45, 8 o'clock, he looked out the window and there she was again, elegantly dressed, walking tall and elegantly. Oh, he was amazed once again. He spent the rest of the day watching Judge Judy and Maury Povich. And the next morning he got up and there she was again and again and again. Every day, the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The months changed the seasons. Here she was every morning walking toward that metro. I asked him, why don't you just go out and speak to the lady? Just say something, anything. He said, no, she's so mesmerizingly beautiful that I can't imagine what I might say. So rather than going out and speaking with her, he decided to write a song. And this is the song he came up with. I've been alone with you inside my mind, and in my dreams I've kissed your lips 1,000 times. Sometimes I see you pass outside my door. Hello, is it me you're looking for? I can see it in your eyes. I can see it in your smile. You're all I've ever wanted. My arms are open wide. Girl, you know just what to say, and you know just what to do. And I want to tell you so much. I love you. I long to see the sunrise in your head, to tell you time and time again how much I care. Sometimes I feel my heart will overflow. Hello, I've just got to let you know that I wonder where you are, and I wonder what you do. Are you somewhere feeling lonely? Is someone loving you? Tell me how to win your heart, for I haven't got a clue. Oh, but let me start by saying, oh, I love you. Mr. Gaskell. Hello, I've just got to let you know that I wonder where you are, and I wonder what you do. Are you somewhere feeling lonely, or is someone else loving you? Tell me how to win your heart. See, I haven't got a clue. Oh, but let me start by saying, oh, pretty, elegant, lovely lady, I love you. Oh, thank you. Gracias. Yeah, that was one of those U Street stories you never forget, you know. There are many, many more. I've got sunshine on a cloudy day, and when it's cold outside, I've got the month of May. Well, now I guess you say, what can make me feel this way? It's my girl. I'm talking about my girl. Oh, I've got so much honey, the bees envy me. Yes, I do. I've got a sweeter song that I can sing than the birds in the trees. Now I guess maybe you and you will say, what can make me feel this way? It's my girl. I'm talking about my baby, 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 baby. Ooh, help me out now. Oh, baby, baby. Hey, 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 hey. Oh, yeah. Hey, hey, hey. Ooh, yeah. I don't need no money, fortune or fame, 'cause I voted. I've got all the riches, baby, baby, that any one man could claim. Now I guess maybe you will say, what can make me feel this way? It's my girl. I'm talking about my baby. I've got sunshine on the cloudy day. Oh, with my baby. I've even got the month of May. I've got everything a man could desire. See, that woman sets my soul on fire. I love that girl. She's sweet as can be. She got some kind of voodoo type of rip on me. I love my woman. I'll never let her go. Oh, I love you, baby. Ooh, she's my girl. I like to think of U Street as my girl. I think it's time to bring up our speakers. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you very much. Let's give the great Gaston Trio +1 a round of applause. And I know we're going to be hearing more from you in a few minutes, and thank you very much for being here today. I think we need a couple of minutes to reset the stage. Is that correct? hearty welcome to everybody. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Executive Vice President of the Center, and I want to welcome you here for this marvelous occasion. The Woodrow Wilson Center is the official national memorial to the country's 28th president. We are a public-private institution doing essentially two things. We convene about 800 meetings a year dealing with important public policy issues and promoting nonpartisan dialogue. And second, we welcome scholars from all over the world to come here to do research and writing. There are close to 80 scholars in residence at any one time. Some 1,700 books have been written in this institution over the last 40 years. Today we honor a member of the Woodrow Wilson staff who has written one of these books, Dr. Blair Ruble. Blair is very much in the Wilsonian tradition. He is an accomplished scholar with a keen sense of the key public policy debates. He is a valued member of the talented Wilson Center staff, and he has served for more than 2 decades as the director of the Kennan Institute. He also serves as the director of the Comparative Urban Studies program. Blair is the author of 20 edited books, 6 monographed, and at my count, which may be wrong, 6 books. He brings enormous respect to this institution. Blair, we thank you for all you do for all of us. I now want to turn over the floor to Dr. Philippa Strum, a senior scholar at the Center and the former director of U.S. Studies. She will moderate this event. Flip, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Before we get into the business, may I ask those of you who have cell phones with you or other electronic devices to please turn them off. This program is being webcast, and that interferes with the broadcast. What I would like to do, even before introducing our speakers today, is acknowledge a few people in the audience. You're all very important, and I can't acknowledge all of you, but there are a few people who really deserve to get some recognition. First, Reverend Sandra Butler Truesdale. Stand up, Sandra, won't you? Who has... You're going to be hearing more about her later and from her later. I'll just tell you she's a 5th generation Washingtonian, and she is the person responsible for getting the musicians here today, so we really thank you for that. I'd like to acknowledge Diana Davis Spencer, whose foundation, won't you stand up? Thank you. Whose foundation has been extraordinarily helpful to Blair and to the Kennan Institute, and somebody who's been extraordinarily helpful to Blair generally and has made his life possible, Sally Ruble. Mike has already introduced my colleague, Blair Ruble. I would just like to add a word to the effect that we have something of a Renaissance man in Blair. Among all of those volumes that Mike mentioned to you are volumes that look at cities such as Osaka, Chicago, Moscow, Montreal, as well as Washington. So in Blair, we have somebody who is not only an expert in Russian studies, but somebody who really understands cities, and hence the wonderful book, Washington's U Street, a biography, that we're here to talk about today. I'm not going to say any more about Blair, particularly since you'll be hearing a good bit from Blair. I would like to say a couple of words about Maurice Jackson, our commentator. For those of you who are watching this on the webcast and don't have the biographies in front of you, he is an associate professor of history at Georgetown University, where he teaches courses on African Americans, social movements, and jazz history. So Professor Jackson is affiliated with the Department of Performing Arts, as well as the Department of History. And another Renaissance man. Professor Jackson has been a community organizer, a longshoreman, a house painter, and a construction worker. And he is also the author of Let This Voice Be Heard, Anthony Benezet, which is about a Quaker abolitionist, and he is now working on D.C. Noir, a social, cultural, and intellectual history of African Americans in Washington, D.C. What we're going to do is we're going to hear from Blair Ruble for about 20 minutes, and Professor Jackson will speak, and then we'll turn the microphone over to you, our audience, for questions and answers. So please join me in welcoming once again Blair Ruble.
Well, thank you. I promised myself I would stick to a script so I would be disciplined. But I have to say, looking out over the room and seeing so many friends from so many different parts of Sally and my life here in Washington, I'm really, really thrilled and touched, and I can't thank you enough for coming. And when I say from different parts of my life, in Sally's life, there are people who helped me with the book, there are people, my colleagues here at the Wilson Center, people I met when we were graduate students using the Library of Congress writing our dissertation, so it's really a thrill for me and an honor. I can't possibly thank everyone, but there are a couple of people I need to mention, beginning with Flip and her colleagues with U.S. Studies, Mike Van Dusen, who's our Executive Vice President, Lee Hamilton, who is the Wilson Center President, and all my Kennan Institute and Wilson Center colleagues. I really feel that this is a book I couldn't have written anyplace else. The support has been wonderful. It really was a lunatic idea for for a Russian specialist to try to write this book. And it took a special set of colleagues and friends to actually encourage me and make that possible. And I also want to thank Joe Brindley and Kathy Alexander from the Wilson Center and Johns Hopkins University presses. The presses and their generally, both Joe and Kathy and their staffs have been really wonderful and have been real believers in this project all along. And another real believer has been already introduced, and you'll hear from later, the Reverend Sandra Butler Truesdale has been a true supporter, and I have to thank her. But since I can't thank everybody who helped with the book, I'll thank her for helping bring U Street into the Wilson Center. And I think that's really one of the most important aspects of this day for me. The musicians are wonderful, and they're not just musicians. These are folks who couldn't possibly fade into the background because they are products, in some cases, of growing up on U Street and very much represent the story I want to tell. So I'm tempted to go on. There are many other people I need to thank, but as I said, I'm going to stick to my script because otherwise I'll abuse your patience. So let me now turn to the book and to the community about which it's written. And I hope that the next couple of hours will be a tribute not only to the personal accomplishment of publishing a book, but more importantly, a tribute and a celebration of the personal accomplishments of the thousands of Washingtonians who have made U Street their home since the neighborhood took shape at the end of the Civil War. The story of this book begins with some very special people, and a couple of them are here, and I will mention them because they represent one of the themes of the book. Sally and I had been frequenting a jazz club, Twins Jazz. It was then up at 14th in Colorado, and I don't know, about a decade ago, it relocated down to U Street. It wanted to become part of the U Street scene, and we followed Twins down to U Street. In many ways, this book emerged from conversations at Twins and is my effort to present a gift to the people at Twins who have brought so much beauty and joy into our lives. I dedicate the book to 6 individuals who constantly inspired me as I thought about the book, researched the book, and wrote the book. Because in so many ways, they tell one of the profound stories about DC that I really want to try to communicate. That this is a very real city in which very real people live very real lives. It's not just the nation's capital, it's a real community. So I begin the book by thanking the twins of twins, Kelly and Mazik Tesfaye, and Joe Beasley, who, if anybody's ever been to Twins, you've encountered his special spirit, and three musicians, Nasser Abadeh, James King, and Alan Johnson. And Alan, thank you for coming. I dedicate this book to them because they personify one of the main themes: the steadfast pursuit of beauty against all odds. I begin the book with an epigraph which tells a story that takes me more than 340 pages to tell in just 34 words. But before I read the epigraph, I want to tell a story about it because it does bring together in some ways Russia and U Street. Anybody who's entered the world of Russia, has been there, has worked there, has lived there, or even just has read a Russian novel, knows that Russia, not unlike U Street, is a place where the inconceivable coincidence seems normal. And indeed, inconceivable coincidences are really valuable moments in life. They're to be seized because they bring fresh energy and make life interesting and exciting and worth living. Why else would they take place? Well, part of the story of this book has to do with one inconceivable coincidence. Sally and I were returning from spending Christmas at the family farm in North Carolina, and it was dark and it was cold, and we had fought our way up I-95 from Richmond, and we were tired, and we pulled up to our apartment building in DuPont Circle and began unloading the car, when suddenly a certain Buddies, Boris, came bounding out of the front door of our apartment building. Well, this wasn't just any Boris. This Boris happened to be one of the Soviet Union's and Russia's leading social scientists. He was the kind of guy, when he was sent into exile to Prague, wrote the definitive Russian language history of beer. And he also was one of a very small number of Soviet social scientists who had helped me when I was trying to write my dissertation. So I couldn't imagine why this Boris was coming out of the front door of our apartment building in Washington, D.C., and he breathlessly explained that his daughter Olga had just moved in. And Olga, it turns out, has become one of our city's most artistic writers. And the epigraph, which so concisely explains what my book is about, comes from her haunting debut novel, The Dream Life of Sukhanov. My then neighbor, Olga Grushin, wrote these words just as I was trying to think about how to tell the U Street story. And Olga, she's here, and I would like to thank her as well. Thank you, Olga. Towards the end of the novel, she writes the following passage. In spite of all the injustices and horrors and stupidity, beauty always survives, and there will never be a higher mission than making the world richer and purer by adding more beauty to it. The message of my book is that U Street has been, since its founding, just such a place where people have constantly striven in the face of injustice, horror, and stupidity to make the world richer and purer by adding beauty to it. That's what Kelly and Mazi and Joseph and Nasser and James and Alan have been doing all these years at Twins. That's what literally thousands of Washingtonians have been doing along U Street since the street came into being. If creating beauty in the face of injustice, horror, and stupidity is one grand theme of the book, the second is about how this community and neighborhood have served as a zone of contact among various groups in Washington throughout the history of the street. The U Street area has fostered creativity by bringing a variety of people who often could barely tolerate one another, crashing together as they came and went from their homes, apartments, places of worships, theaters, schools, restaurants, and stadiums. Located in the geographic heart of the city, the neighborhood grew up around streetcar routes and has remained a major transportation hub ever since. It's a place where cultures and people have met, clashed, and grappled with each other, sometimes violently, ever since the neighborhood took shape during the Civil War. Such urban spaces confront and confound, constantly challenging people to rethink who they are and with whom they share common fates. They are the wetlands of urban life. Like wetlands in the natural environment, these fragile mixing bowls of diversity often appear to outsiders to be little more than wastelands. They're the first places to be rebuilt, redesigned, reconceived, and reconstituted when reformers think about improving a city. Yet this is a terrible mistake. Like wetlands, these spaces are among the most productive corners of the urban environment. Like wetlands, they can be nurtured as well as destroyed, renewed as well as dissipated. The story of U Street is the story of how such neighborhoods work and how outsiders want to clean them up, rebuild them, and remove them from view. Both of these main themes, the creation of beauty in the face of horror, injustice, and stupidity, and the importance of urban zones of contact, run throughout every period of U Street's history, and to my mind underscore the importance of a constant struggle for survival with dignity. These are threads running throughout the U Street story, even during the neighborhood's so-called nadir during the 1970s. U Street, at least until now, has always managed to give people something important and valuable to hold on to, even as it has constantly changed and evolved. Now, I can't possibly do justice to this story in the 10 minutes remaining to me, so what I'm going to do is read for no more than 10 minutes, I promise, from the beginning and end of the book. And if you find it interesting, I'm sure that Don Allen from Teaching for Change's Busboy and Poets bookstore outside will be glad to sell you a book. And he's very much part of this neighborhood as well. So let me begin with the beginning of the book. Washington is a city of spirits, but not the Hollywood demons of pulp fiction that are exercised on film and television screens to the delight of millions. It is a city of the spirits of the African field workers owned by Notley Young, who farmed the lowlands on the site of the future Jefferson Memorial, of the human chattel who endured the horrors of one of America's largest slave markets set down on the land where the Department of Energy now stands, of slaves and poor market workers who were shuttled along streets long since buried under the Federal Triangle's government offices, and of the thousands of terrorized slaves who fled across the front lines of the Civil War, America's bloodiest, to become figuratively and legally nothing more than contraband. Centuries later, their spirits still animate Washington's political, social, and cultural life. Washington, or alternatively the District of Columbia, familiarly the District or DC, is not merely the artifice of an 18th century rationalist mind cast out like a board game across a landscape rendered absent of distinguishing characteristics. Yet the image of Washington as an architectural apparition rather than as a place soon took hold in the American imagination. Instead, as this book seeks to reveal, Washington is a real city, a messy city, a city that indeed has something that so many have wanted to ignore, a history all its own. Washington has nurtured urban communities that have produced more than their fair share of local stories, including accomplishments and misdeeds that have altered the nation. These real African-American urban communities exist in the District of Columbia with authentic American urban tales to tell. But more often than not, they've been ignored or denigrated by the white authorities, both local and national, that have simultaneously dismissed the stories of the complex and diverse white communities that have also formed in the city of Washington ever since it was established more than 2 centuries ago. Many of these local stories can be traced back to a handful of city blocks along what is now known as U Street. This U Street neighborhood's most celebrated offspring, Edward Kennedy Duke Ellington, fondly recalled growing up near 13th and T in his memoirs, "Music is My Mistress." An elderly Ellington reflected on taking his first piano lessons from Mrs. Marietta Clinkscales, selling peanuts, popcorn, candy, and cigars at ball games at nearby Griffith Stadium, exploring the city with his cousin Sonny, and playing sandlot baseball on a vacant lot along 16th Street in front of the solitary figure of President Teddy Roosevelt on his horse. Readers who are having difficulty imagining Ellington's Washington as a real city have probably missed his description of Frank Holliday's pool room next to the Lincoln Theater. Holiday's Place, Ellington wrote, was not a normal neighborhood-type pool room. It was the high-spotted billiard parlors. Guys from all walks of life seemed to converge there. School kids over and under 16, college students and graduates, some starting out in law and medicine and science, and lots of Pullman porters and dining car waiters. This pool room was a home away from home for a diverse cast of characters. Dr. Charles Drew, who became famous for his work with blood plasma, a hustler named Clarence Snake Cabanis, scores of porters and waiters, and most important for the young Ellington, the best piano players in town. Holiday's pool room was the sort of social mixing bowl that makes real cities, urban communities where people build real lives. So that's how I start the book. And now I'll turn and wrap up with the end of the book. Beauty in the face of folly. By the end of the first decade of the 21st century, on any given Saturday night, dozens of venues present some sort of live performance along U Street and nearby streets. Some of the city's trendiest restaurants and bars line the streets, catching the attention of travel writers from the New York Times to Austrian Airlines. Black Broadway is back, only without some of the black, as U Street has become a playground for an emerging Washington that is younger and more diverse racially, ethnically, and culturally than the city has ever been before. This is the good news. The bad news has been that working-class African Americans, who in many ways invented and have sustained the street as a creative center, have had an increasingly difficult time maintaining their presence in the neighborhood and in the city. Perhaps even worse news would be if the spunky and gritty clubs that characterize the area become just as rare in the years ahead as the working-class culture that first created them. The good news is that U Street did not become what Southwest Washington became. The bad news is that no one has quite figured out how to improve a neighborhood while keeping the original residents in place. Another piece of good news is that the neighborhood's identification with its African American past provides a core meaning to what the street can become. Those promoting the neighborhood embrace, rather than cover over, African American cultural achievement. In this sense, U Street has preserved that aspect of Washington that makes the city so much more than its image as merely the seat of American power. But U Street is about more than the genius of an Ellington or a Langston Hughes. U Street throughout its history has been replete with the improvised relationships and co-presence of people separated by intractable conflicts of race, ethnicity, faith, gender, sexual orientation, and class. As they pursued their causes or pleasures, have clashed or sought to cooperate, they have found ways to do so with a particular sense of purpose. In ways large and small, these many residents have proclaimed their deep human right to be in this place at this time. The contrabands of the Civil War and their encampments, the economically diverse homeowners of the 1870s and their brick houses, the brilliant Francis Grimke from his pulpit at the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, the acerbic William Calvin Chase in the pages of the Washington Bee, the flashy Sportin' Daniels styling down U Street at the height of the Depression, the curmudgeonly Carter Woodson from the Journal of Negro History, the magisterial Mary Church Terrell and Mary McLeod Bethune on their picket lines, the ferociously angry Gardner Bishop in his barber shop, the burned-out Jewish merchants and government offices trying to reclaim their losses after 1968, and the straight-laced Walter Fauntleroy at neighborhood meetings. Throughout its history, U Street has been where the aggrieved and the displaced have staked out their possession of the city. They have done so ever since the street and its community first took shape 15 decades ago. Their lives are not the material for real estate advertisements and restaurant menus. Nevertheless, their legacies have made such self-promotion possible. In the end, the beauty of individual and collective accomplishment born of a creative social intelligence has made U Street an indispensable corner of Washington and American soil. Is the new U just a superficial, commercialized sham, replacing the authentic old U Street? Perhaps this is the case. As Nadine Gordimer has observed, the past has no wholeness. It has been twilated by revised explanations of it, trampled over by hindsight. The new U is in many ways an twilated vision of the old U. U Street's elder jazz historian and radio personality Jamal Muhammad might have been closer to the truth when he observed, while people of different races and ethnicities coexist along today's U Street without commingling, such coexistence might be the first step towards something new. One day, he suggests, there will be real diversity, and people will frequent the area and color won't matter. We'll all just hang out because we all have the same interest. Rather than lamenting contemporary reality with the assurance of a rant on a blog, this book urges every reader to step back and ask Olga Grushin's question instead. In the face of all this new silliness and stupidity, is U Street still a place where people come and go as they make the world richer and purer by adding more beauty to it? There is indeed no higher mission for an urban community to fulfill. Throughout its history until this very day, U Street has been one of the few urban communities that rightfully can claim to have done so. The value of its future incarnations will be found in whether or not the people who make U Street new will continue to add beauty to the world. Thank you very much.
I'm not going to read from these if you think I won't take, but I just want to show you what a great book it is that for you all would take and mark every page as we historians do. As I walked in today, a young fellow said to me, "You must be the keyboardist," and I didn't. I had my pork pie hat. I wear hats like Monk and Ben Webster and others. And I thought, "You mean the pianist?" Because that's. Then I thought of a dear friend, Hank Jones, who I've just worked with on the last project before he died, writing some liner notes with he and Charlie Hayden. And last time I saw him was on U Street. So it's just a great privilege to be here to speak on Blair's book. I should tell you that one reason I got to know Blair was because of Russia, and because of one of our mutual friends, Richard Stites, introduced us. And I had, over the years, traveled to Russia many, many times. But it's a pleasure to be here at the Wilson Center and to read and to be able to be a part of this discussion on Blair Ruble's book. This is, in fact, an exciting period for Washington, D.C. history. For several other books on Washington, D.C. are coming out, have come out in the last month or so. One is by Professor Clarence Lusane of the American University, called The Black History of the White House, and it will chronicle the role of African Americans both as butlers, as maids, as national security advisors to several administrations, and that will be an important work, I think. The other is by Northwestern historian Kate Masur, who wrote a wonderful book on Reconstruction in Washington, D.C. An Example for All the Land is its title. And these works, coupled with Blair's, put to rest the notion that the history of Washington, D.C. is a second-rate history, a second-class history, a history that has no effect on public policy or debates. This history is just as important as it's the history of Pennsylvania or Moscow or Istanbul or anywhere else. And for an 18th century historian, one who spends their time in archives, I think that rings true. Having read every note, listen to every note that goes through, as in music, every detail, I can tell you that this book is a magisterial one. This book brings to life the history of a not-so-secret city. Many years ago, a famous writer wrote that Washington, D.C. is a city where the American dream and the American nightmare pass each other on the street and never speak. And today, it's pretty much the same. I teach at Georgetown University. I don't live in Georgetown. I know from that. And Blair has taken a unique approach to developing this theory. He's shown that from the very first days when blacks were paraded up and down Capitol Hill in shackles, that these divisions have existed, yet there was always a movement to bring together peoples. He's shown that from the very beginning of the debates over slavery in 1835 with Snow Rider, 1848 with the Pearl Incident, and others, that there has been these movements towards equality and towards the movements of peoples. Yet, those are important things, but what I found most fascinating about the book are its center. are those things that get to the essence of that neighborhood of which he's speaking about. And most importantly, I found when he links the strains even within the African-American community, where you have people in the American dream and American nightmare amongst black people pass each other daily and never spoke, between light and black, between rich and poor, between others. And one of the great points is when he points to the tensions between 7th Street and U Street. I found that quite fascinating. Between the uppity and between those at the bottom of the well. And he took very good care. Took care as a white person must take when you are dealing with sensitive issues amongst the African-American peoples. It would not be fair if you didn't. And I must praise him for taking diligent care. For example, many times white people will write and they just relish using the N-word, just relish it. And never once did he use it outside of a quotation within a period of time when someone else. But to some it may mean nothing. To a person like me, it shows how a person deals with something with care and love and the necessity for understanding the depth of the problem. And then he goes down on these points, just point out the variances. For example, he didn't mention it, but I'll mention this. W.B. Du Bois never listened to jazz. He would have thought you were nuts. But he did listen to Dvorak. He did listen to the classical musicians. And Dvorak had a love for jazz and the blues. And therefore, Du Bois, by reading that, had a love for that. And he could move from 7th Street to Howard to U Street. You see, history works that way. Life works that way. Now, Blair has a beautiful phrase, and I'll just read this. Says he, along 7th Street, African Americans from alley slums to proper townhouses ran into one another, interacted with one another, and became a shared community. And then lady says, U Street probably never would have emerged as one of the most creative places in America had it not been for 7th Street. You see, he's using that dialectical unity, the importance of people, whatever the ideas, to come together based on cultural and common identity. At another point, he goes into something that I think is equally important about U Street. It's fascinating. Yet U Street, more than another Broadway, including not only the Broadway of New York's Midtown Theater District, but also the Broadway of the financial district downtown, of the social protest of Union Square, of the fancy residential district of the Upper West Side, of the great University of Columbia and City College of New York uptown, of the theological centers of Riverside Heights, and of the African American cultural centers in Harlem. Thus, U Street was everything that Broadway was, except more. U Street combined in just a few short blocks what took Broadway a dozen miles or more to contain. Now that, my friends, is, as we say, deep. That is quite profound. Because U Street represents that. It represents the bringing the culture, the financial district. At another point, he shows the elder Michaud, the great minister, personally saved the Industrial Bank and the Howard Theater. Now, what a phenomenal. Oh, wouldn't it be lovely if we got a preacher, any preacher do that today? Any preacher. I better stop it. And unlike on New York's Broadway said, U Street, all of them existing on top of each other. And then he gives other just fascinating points. See, the beauty of a great book is not what you know, it's what you don't know. And certain things. For example, this man, he talks about a man, Charles Hostin Williams, who was instrumental in introducing black dance to America. Now, this man was the first man to found the modern dance at Howard University. Therefore, long before Balanchine and others took ballet to New York. But what else did he do? It's fascinating. Would you imagine? He found the CIAA, the Collegiate Intercollegiate Athletic Commission. This is where the black ball players come from. A couple of years ago, I went to a reading down here, opening with Earl of Pearl Monroe, those of you who love basketball as little as I do, and it was down there, Black Magic, and this was the CIAA. But this, man, can you imagine this happening anywhere else? You can bring modern dance to the university, and you can bring African-American sports, and the impact this would have on the lives of others. And the book is full of such details like that. One detail he didn't mention, that's why I brought this little book, is that a man named Thomas Ward actually invented the three-point shot, and he was a man who was from D.C., a former slave. Now, that's just a fascinating side point that you'd have to be a lover of basketball like me to understand. And then Blair brings up so many other points. For example, in 1910, says he, 80% of the black populations were literate, as opposed to 55% nationwide. 80? Now, Washington, D.C. today, 67% of African-American male do not graduate school. Whether they call them literal or not, I don't know. But it's not just on black folks. It's not just on black. It must go farther. And see, so we solve problems, but then we go back. He talks about businesses in U Street. And at one point, hundreds of businesses on U Street, African-American businesses. You can walk from one end of U Street to the other. You might find 3 or 4. I don't know. Maybe Blair's done it. But it is rather sad. Not many. But he points out certain reasons. But, of course, these are things we must continue answering. He does point out that when African-Americans leave, they generally come back for several reasons, right? They come back to play the number. They come back to go to church until people start protesting up, Mr. Mamima, up by some of the areas. When people start protesting because they want to come back and pray on Sunday, people don't think you have the right to do it. He points out many of these other things. So you have all of these details that are there. And he does something that I am quite proud of. He takes on the Washington Post. This Washington Post, who has treated African Americans so badly. And, of course, it's not Jackson saying it, it's Dr. Ruble who's pointing it out. Says he, the Washington Post 1930s, this is the Washington Post 1930s. Now, 1930s, around the same time that Marian Anderson wants to sing at Constitution Hall, the DER, the Daughters of American Revolution, of course, as you know, did not have that right. That same year, Billie Holiday sings a Strange Feud. And Mrs. Anderson can't sing The Great Lady. Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt stands her defense. Those who decry Mrs. Roosevelt talk about this buck-teeth lady and everything, but not understand that African Americans have a great admiration for her as he stands there and fights for the right of Marian Anderson to sing. But said the Washington Post, and I quote, "The theaters, nightclubs, and restaurants in Washington are the only place that we can escape mingling with Negroes. So be sure to keep it that way." End of quote, said the Washington Post in 1930. And then, of course, in the riot of 1919, the Washington Post again was at it, calling for the rioters, the white rioters, to clean up the city. And so Blair goes into all these wonderful details. He looks at the sports history, and it's an important history, and talks about the idea of that venerable sports reporter, Shirley Povich. And said Shirley Povich, something that we all know, and quote, "The Redskin colors are burgundy, gold, and Caucasian." Of course, they've integrated since then, but we still hope they can play a little better. He talks about some of the great sports figures in Washington, and they are legendary, some who I read as a kid. The great Sam Lacey. He talks about the great Buck Leonard, the great ball player. He talks about people who've infected the lives of myself and Mrs. Truesdale and many others, of Julius Hobson, that we know helped found the statehood part in the Free D.C. movement. He speaks of David Eaton, my personal favorite, who was the minister of All Souls Unitarian Church. And as a 18, 19-year-old kid, he'd call into his office, and he'd say, "Jack, let's have a talk about this." And we'd have great philosophical talks. He talked about Art Carter, the venerable man at the Washington African-American, who was so many years there, but also was until I read, I didn't know, a promoter of sports events. I knew he had been a sports writer. He talks about another man that I knew well, the great Sterling Brown, the great poet of Washington, D.C. I had a bookstore, and sometimes Sterling would come in, and I always kept a little bourbon in the back because Sterling liked it that way. But what a poet was Sterling. He talks about David Clark. I don't think David Clark would like the fact that he calls him a radical. David Clark probably would have argued because they moved back and forth a lot. He talks about Mr. Fauntleroy, who he calls short and pudgy. I'm sure that, Walter Fauntleroy. And he talks about a very dear friend of mine, a man called the Bama, Walter Washington. Jerry Washington. Jerry Washington was a very conservative African-American man. He was a very close friend to Lee Atwater, but he knew the blues like no one. And he would come in some days, we worked together at UPO, and he'd bring me some clothes that the bullets had handed down. They wore these sharp clothes. When they got too old, they wore them once. He'd give them to me. I was 6'2", 6'3", and so I'd wear them. And and we have these great stories about the blues and jazz. He writes about Petey Green, that great man who scared you to action. He spoke about John Wilson, the great friend of all of ours who led the Washington, D.C. Council and knew every detail about it. And Blair Ruble has given truth to the words of Charles Dickens. He has written about the city of magnificent intentions, and he's done it magnificently and with great intentions. Thank you.
Unwired. Thank you both so much. This is now going to be your time, you in the audience. Oh, terrific. Okay, and will you give one for Professor Jackson too? And then, great. All right, we're ready for your questions. Will you, when you're recognized, please wait for the microphone to come to you and identify yourself before you ask your question. I will ask you to keep your questions relatively brief because I know that there's going to be a lot of people who will want to have a chance at the microphone. So who would like to start us off? Well, if you're all going to be very quiet, all right, let me just ask Blair a quick question to start us off, if that's okay. Blair, you call this a biography of U Street. And we all know that biography is a word that's usually used to describe a person, not a place. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose that word?
Well, I chose the word because I wanted to tell a complete, all-rounded history and to make the community a whole and a real living being and not just an object of study. I have to admit this is a little bit in vogue in urban studies. There have been biographies of different cities that have been written. There's a great so-called biography of Mexico City that came out about 20 years ago. And I think much more than history, I wanted to communicate a sense of completeness that I was striving for.
Which you do. I want to just jump in here, and then I promise I'm going to call on you and anybody else who has his or her hand up. But this is an incredibly rich book. And when Blair read the parts that he did and talked about people, and Professor Jackson talked about the people, that's one of the things that makes this book really great, that in this sense it really is a biography, I guess, of a lot of people, that you get all of the characters from the Civil War on who made U Street and the neighborhood around it what it is. And Blair's got what we who do legal studies would call sidebars every once in a while, which are longer biographies or pieces about various people in the book, and it just makes for fascinating reading. When you finished it, you really know a piece of history that was totally mysterious to you before. It's really quite amazing. All right, sir, I've promised you the microphone. Will you identify yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Harley Balzer from Georgetown University. Blair, thank you. Some of us have seen parts of this before, but not everything gets into a book. What's your favorite story that's not in here?
Oh, there are some stories about Marion Barry that aren't in there that various people told me, and they will remain not public. Marion Barry is a source of endless, marvelous tales. But there are a few stories that are in there that I like. I was asked what story do I like the best, and there are a couple. Obviously, the P.D. Green story about how he got out of prison. I won't spoil it. It's on something like page 244 of the book. It's a page with his photograph. 245. It's a fabulous story. But the two, one is in a footnote. It has to do with how Marion Barry used to get money from the Ford administration by going in and yelling and screaming at Rumsfeld. And I kind of like that image. And the other is allegedly Lyndon Johnson, upon being told that Stokely Carmichael was leading a band of angry protesters to burn Georgetown, declared, "Gee, I've waited 30 years for this moment." So it's really it's a wonderful, colorful place with wonderful stories. And I think that that's important. And I want to go back to something that I said. There are many reasons why I wrote the book, but one was an evening at Twins when people like Alan were talking about what the neighborhood meant to them. But another was a series of articles and letters to the editor in the city paper that said, Washington has no history that anybody could care about. And all the conversations I have had with people, which I think many of you have had, where no one comes from Washington. And I see Margie and Harley jump because they actually do come from Washington. But that's what I was responding to. And that's why there are lots of stories about real people in the book.
All right, can you get the microphone there, please?
Hi, Martha Bohachevsky. Thanks a lot, Blair. Perhaps you can discuss how you went about doing the research for this book. Just the way you began it and how you got many of the stories.
You know, I started out, I wanted to write about gentrification. And I started talking to people in the neighborhood, and they kept talking about this history, and they kept going further and further back. And I started looking around, and I started reading some memoirs, and I started, then I began to discover that there are a lot of dissertations and master's theses written about Washington. I'm glad Kate Mazur's book is out. It was a wonderful dissertation. I'm sure it's a wonderful book. Maria McQuitter, I don't know if she's here right now, she wrote an incredible dissertation, and I began to discover these works of others. And one of the things one of the reasons why I try to, I have so many footnotes, is I want people to understand that there is a historiography about Washington that's very, very rich. Maria's dissertation pointed me to this great 1927 book by, I think it's William Johnson, on the leisure life of the Negro in Washington, D.C. What an incredible book. He was a professor at Howard University. And so in a way, I was able to literally build on the work of others. There's a lot there. Then there was a lot of, it wasn't so much archival research, there was a lot of work with newspapers. Being here, it would have been hard to dive into archives.
Please.
Hi, Shannon Mouton, second generation Washingtonian. What are you considering U Street? Are you really, what boundaries are you looking in for the corridor?
Oh, I'm totally shameless. It's very elastic. And my model for this is there's a couple of studies of a street in Moscow called the Arbat, which is a street, but it's also a district. And what I consider U Street changes from period to period. But basically, I'm looking at an area that runs further east than you might think, from about 3rd, because I wanted to include Howard, over to as far west as 18th, so you could get Strivers Row in. And then it expands as Shaw becomes a real meaningful place in the 60s and 70s. So there is some work on Shaw. Ibrahim is here as a Shaw activist. But I really do try to keep it roughly, from sort of T up to the boundary of the old plan, from Howard roughly over to Strivers Row. But if I need to be expansive, I am.
In the back, please.
Blair, there was a baseball team called the
Washington. Do you want to identify yourself?
Oh, Stephen Shore. There was a baseball team called the Washington Senators, and you haven't mentioned them so far. Do they play any role in your book?
Well, the Senators play a very large role in the book. It's a very sad story, quite frankly. The baseball park was there, but the owners, the Griffiths family, really looked down on the neighborhood. And you know, there's a lot of, this is one thing I couldn't untangle. Talking to people and reading memoirs, there's some African Americans who remember going there fondly, and there are others who are saying they were segregated. They weren't formally segregated. The stadium played, they would rent it out, so it played a very important role in community life. There were these incredible military drills that took place. But the Senators, basically their owners, I mean, one of the reasons why Griffith moved the team to Minnesota, he was explicit about it. It was the whitest big league city in America. And he looked down on black ball players when he had some of the greatest ball players who ever played the game playing for the Homestead Grays in his own stadium.
But the story of the Homestead Grays becomes important because this as Blair can tell you, he's losing money on the Senators, but he's making money renting the stadium to the Grays. And the Grays go, and every week they pack the stadium. And if you just read a book, you know, I've just read a book on Lena Horne, and I've just read a book on Sugar Ray Robinson, and other things like that. And so, and all these people, all these stories, the Homestead Grays come in, because this circuit of black athletes is just so important. And so this man with his race, I mean, you should, and Blair documents beautifully some of the racist venom he spouts. And so when he left, we say, just bye.
Yeah.
But they did. Go ahead.
And of course, the other thing, this actually gets into the cost of segregation.
Right.
He fielded some of the worst teams ever fielded in the history of the sport. Just because, and he was one of the last owners to integrate.
But
so
the Redskins were the
last.
Were the last.
Yeah. The Redskins story is even more outrageous.
It's even worse.
Yeah.
Can we get the microphone up in the front here and then this?
I'm Dan Abley, former employee at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and a good friend of Blair's. Blair, you started off talking about your connection with jazz and U Street. I know you and Sally are big fans of jazz. You know, when I look at other cities in the United States, with New Orleans and St. Louis and Chicago and New York, there's that real connection with jazz in those cities. Could you extrapolate, if you would, a bit on the origins of jazz and U Street and what that special connection is?
Well, this has to do with the emergence of U Street as an entertainment center. And it's actually a very interesting story because you had, first off, the Howard was owned by a white man, but he allowed African Americans to manage it. And some of those managers built up what became known as the Chitlin Circuit. And Washington was the center of, it didn't have large enough audiences to compete with New York or Chicago, but it had the sort of the brain trust of entertainment. And there were all these great clubs, and there were all these great musicians. You're going to hear some in a moment. You have some of them in the room who really grew up, and jazz at the time was part of that story. But as importantly, it's not only about jazz. I mean, it's you have the whole local grown go-go community here. You have a number of homegrown musical traditions, and I think music is a really, really important part of the story, and it goes back to what I wanted to say about creating beauty. It was a way of trying to assert through the creation of beauty the right to be here. And I think the larger story is about the right to be here. Now, I also think there are lots of other U Streets in the U.S., and the kind of main street of segregated Africa-American city life, and there are equivalents in many, many other cities. It's, in some ways, it's not a unique story. I view the story as being layered between the very local that we've been talking a bit about and the very grand, this notion of what cities and these kinds of neighborhoods do, but there's an intermediary level in which Washington was the point of experimentation for national policy, but what happened here can be seen in all the cities you just mentioned.
There's a question here, please.
Blair, I was a reporter.
Jamie, want to identify yourself?
Sure. Jamie Steam. I'm a former scholar here at the Wilson Center in U.S. Studies, and formerly a reporter for the Baltimore Sun. So as you were speaking of this vibrant musical scene here in Washington, there was also one 50 miles to the north. And I was wondering if you discovered any mutual influence between the cities in terms of kinship or going back and forth, if there was any kind of, relationship between Washington
Maurice
and
may
Baltimore.
want to answer this too. There's a very direct connection right down to, we didn't talk a lot about 1919, but whites set on the neighborhood to, quote, clean it up after being urged to rally on Pennsylvania Avenue by the Washington Post, and it set off days of rioting. And I think this is when U Street became a real community, because they organized their own defense. And the arms that they used to defend themselves came from Baltimore.
It's a port city, so you can port the...
And a lot of people went back. It was, in some ways, it was one community. I mean, obviously, people like Thurgood Marshall is from both communities. And even before the Civil War, Washington, Baltimore, and St. Louis were the three American cities that had majority freedmen, non-slave African-American communities. So there are great similarities and connections. I don't know if you want to expound on it.
In music, especially in the, in the 50s and 60s, Baltimore had the Left Bank Jazz Society. This was societies developed in Washington, had them too. And they had great musicians, Ernest Anderson and many, even today. One of the great judges, Billy Murphy, is a great drummer. So you have all these things, and his family owned African American, which makes it very important. I think one thing about jazz and music and history, I think we have to keep looking at is because, Blair brings up the question of desegregation, and it's a question we have to think about a lot more, because I think it's deeper than the fact that desegregation came about, and therefore the schools and culture and everything sort of slid a little bit. I think that Blair opens it up, but I think we have to go more, because I'm not willing to accept that. I'm not willing to accept that African Americans would be so naive as to let, when schools separate, to let their education go down. Now, there are many other questions that come into it. African American teachers who couldn't get jobs some places, some would get them. But the same thing goes with music. You see, around the 50s, jazz is a big onslaught on jazz. Jazz is seen as progressive music, and so therefore the playing of this music amongst some has a negative impact, and jazz musicians are blacklisted and other things. But at the same time all this is happening, U Street is in its decline. But is it enough for us to think and to know that this music can't find another place? Because in other cities there are other places, but in Washington there are not so many other places. And why is that? Because music has played a great role. Blair talks about it in one page, and I was just at the Turkish embassy the other night. The great, and I was in Turkey to talk about it, the great founder of Atlantic Records, Ahmet Ertegun, in 1936-37, personally helped integrate Washington, and he did it with jazz. And he did it, it's very interesting because he did it at the Jewish Community Center at 16th and P. And so there are differences now, Israel, affirmative action, all those things we know well. But there was that commonality. When Artie Shaw came down and played here in Washington, Artie Shaw, of course, Billie Holiday had played with Artie Shaw. And so you have all those things. And Artie Shaw stood up for her when they went down. So you have all those links with music and jazz and integration. If only people would let people be. But the Washington Post didn't want it, so I guess it wasn't going to happen.
We are beating up on the Washington Post.
Well, the Washington Post had a piece in it last week. I don't know if they knew what they said, but it was around the elections, and then they quoted a lady who said, "If this man wins, I'm moving to the suburbs." Now, I didn't know who would win or who would lose, but it harked back to those old days. If this happens, I'm moving to the suburbs. You see, so if I say a little bit. I didn't say who they were supposed to. It's what they said.
Right here, please.
Hi, I'm Diana Spencer. Blair, did you meet many multi-generations living on U Street? And with gentrification, were some of them pushed out? And in terms of work, do they work there, or what?
Well, I did. I mean, there's some people in this room who have multi-generational ties to that neighborhood. But in general, with desegregation, a couple of things happen. One, the more professional, more middle-class layer of U Street had opportunities to move out, and they started to move out. The other thing that happened, which is a big part of the story, as far as I'm concerned, is the Southwest redevelopment, which destroyed a neighborhood into which rural migrants came and got their foothold in the city. And all this was happening at once. So you have, you have multi-generational families, but they're no longer rooted in this particular neighborhood, although some people have stayed, and there are a couple of people in this room who represent multi-generational commitment to this neighborhood. The businesses really now are not locally owned, and I think that's one of the challenges for the future. So there is, and this is really going to be more your book, Maurice, there are many, many multi-generational Washingtonian families, without question, but they're less tied to this particular neighborhood now than they used to be. And I just want to say on schools have long been a flashpoint because people have been very concerned about the quality of education of their children.
Exactly.
We've just got time for 2 more questions, so let's bundle them, the gentleman here and the lady behind him.
I'm Steve Grant, and this might actually be in itself a couple of part questions. When I first came to the area in the early 70s, Blair, I remember my colleagues at GW saying that until about 1960, this was a sleepy southern town, and I suspect the emphasis was on southern, with all the connotations that might have. But clearly the implication was that Kennedy made a transformation, that is, and big government. And the corollary of my question then is, would you dispute or agree partly with that assessment that I heard when I first came? And what has been the impact of increasingly large government in the city? Is it mostly negative or mostly positive?
Let's get the other question before you answer, if that's it.
Hi, I'm Megan Parker. I work here at the Wilson Center. And building on an earlier question, one could argue that DC has made an outsized contribution to American music, at least in terms of its population, not just in jazz, but also in bluegrass and R&B and punk music. But however, the city is not considered to be a music tourism destination the same way that, say, New Orleans or Austin is. Why do you think that is, and do you think that's changing?
Well, first, I have a chapter, As in the South, and it comes from a remark made by Langston Hughes on how living in Washington is like living in the South, except he can ride in the front of streetcars. And I pointed out that he actually could do a couple of other things. He could roll Easter eggs on the White House lawn. He could go to the reading room of the Library of Congress in the DC Public Library, but that was about it. And this was very much a southern city, and historically has been a southern city.
Let's tell them the watermelon story. That would pay it.
Well, I don't know how many of you, some of you may know this story, but when there was a fight for home rule in the district, the chairman of the House District Committee from South Carolina sent a truck of watermelons down to the district building. That's what he thought of the city. So this was most decidedly a southern place and an old southern place. And the government has changed it. And I think not just the government itself, but all the ways in which all the industries that relate to the government. I mean, the metropolitan area, actually private employers are more important now than government employers. But I think for the African American community, the government has been important because it provided stable employment.
GGJ, good government job.
Yep. And that's very, very important for the story. In terms of music, I think, part of what drove this is, I think in music as in everything else, there's a view of Washington, well, today's election day, and what are people campaigning on? They're campaigning on evil Washington. There's a general view in American culture that this isn't a real place, that there's nothing real here, that real life takes place outside the Beltway. And I don't want to say that real life doesn't take place outside the Beltway, but I think when you get into a field like music, there are great musicians here. They're great musicians. There's one sitting right here.
He has his hand up. He wants to say something.
And they don't get the respect that they deserve. And so no, I think there's a real struggle now to expand what the tourist experience in D.C. will be. But that's also very contested, and that's one of the things I write about.
Let's hear from our great musician with his hand.
I'm Ibrahim Mukman. I'm not a musician. I sing in the shower. That's probably my contribution. My question, Blair, is that you mentioned, I think today is election day, and during the primary struggle, the Post and others talked about the election was polarizing Washington D.C. or indicating that. And I'd be curious if you would take a moment and talk about how this is not unique in Washington, and I think it's a blessing that we have your book coming out today, and the person who I think will win the election for mayor, Vince Gray, is talking about building one city. I'd be curious to hear you talk about the similarities between what happened in the recent election, the talk about polarization, and the history of U Street and Shaw.
Well, you just have to look at the polls of who supported Fenty and who supported Vincent Gray. And it's clear that the city is, in many ways, as polarized as it's ever been. That's why I like Jamal Muhammad's quote that I pick up at the end, because what he's saying is what I think really does have to happen. The first thing that has to happen is that people actually have to walk past one another. And then when they walk past one another, they may actually find reasons to have to talk to one another. And out of that can emerge more of one city. But you go down to U Street, tonight. You'll see lots of diversity, but it's layered diversity. And I think this is one of the real challenges we as a community still face. And I think the whole polarization, Ward 3 versus Ward 8 on Fenty and Gray reflects, as far as this city has evolved, it has a long, long way to go before it really will be one city.
We're going to hear from one of Washington's great ladies, actually, in a moment. And I want to take a moment to introduce Reverend Sandra Butler Truesdale to you before she comes up to this stage. She's the president and consultant of the Paul Lawrence Dunbar Apartments Association, Incorporated. But she's extraordinary. She's a senior minister for the Ministries Incorporated. She's the principal and curator of the MMA Gallery. She's the founding member of the D.C. Historic Music Association. She's a member of the Lincoln Theater Board. I could talk to you about all the things she has been, including her service on the D.C. Board of Education and promoting, producing, coordinating the acts for the Howard Theater 100th year celebration. A woman for all time who is also very much a woman of the moment, and she is going to come up, talk to you for a bit, and tell you a little bit more about the Greg Gaston's Trio +1, which will be playing for us again after she speaks. So Sandra, will you come up, please?
Good evening. As I sat here and listened to Blair, and I also listened to the professor, and I thought to myself, my God, I've lived through almost everything that they've discussed, up to and including Elder Lightfoot Solomon Mishaw. I was raised in that church and baptized at Griffith Stadium. He used to rent that stadium and the Happy MI Choir and that whole perspective. I am just thrilled. I do want to tell you a little story when I received an email from my good friend Kathy Smith, and she said she wanted me to meet Blair Ruble, and that he wanted to write a book on U Street. And I thought to myself, you know what? Here's another white person that wants to write something about my history, and I'm not going to talk to him at all. Well, he emailed me again, and since it was Kathy, I said, okay, maybe I better, because Kathy doesn't really take a lot of pushback. So I said, well, maybe I had better just at least listen to him. So he called, and we had a conversation, and I met him. And he said, "Well, I want you to read, just read it." And it was such a thick document, you know. And I'm like, "Oh God, you mean to tell me I have to read something else?" But as I began to read it, I was flabbergasted because I could not believe that he had actually captured the U Street corridor the way that my family, my aunt, who Carlita Taylor Warren, who had danced at the Lincoln Colonnade, and she used to tell me that she danced and jumped off the balcony when Lionel Hampton would play, and she never missed a beat and kept right on dancing. And then I remembered that my mother took me to the Howard Theater to see Lena Horne, and that Lena Horne was a dancer and not a singer. I remembered all that. And then I began to think about the You and Me coffee shop where we used to go and sit and, you know, and sip out of one straw or two straws in a milkshake. And that meant that you were almost engaged, you know. So all those things came in my mind as I began to read it and think about the musicians. You know, Washington, D.C. truly is a great musical town. And there's many differences in where that music comes from. It comes from the 14th Street Corridor. There are 14th Street musicians, and they were basically R&B. And then when you get down a little bit further, there was some jazz down in there and all kinds of things. And then there the U Street Corridor and 9th Street Corridor was basically known for its jazz, the Hollywood and different places. But I just was so taken with the way that he portrayed Washington, D.C. and its U Street. And just, I told him one day, I said, you know, of course, U Street was always integrated. The thing was that it was segregated between the hours of 10 o'clock in the morning until perhaps 2 o'clock in the morning when the after-hour joints opened up. You all know what an after-hour joint is, do I? I don't need to explain that, do I? And after that hour, then it became integrated. And everybody was doing the boogie-woogie and having a ball until about 6 o'clock in the morning when it became light. And when it became light, everybody went into their own separate closets again. But I also want to just talk with you a little bit about the trio, the Greg Gaskins trio, and plus one. Gregory Gaskins was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and actually served papers at the Paul Laurence Dunbar Hotel, which was at 15th and U. And you all know that the senior citizens, let me just stick my chest out. The senior citizens bought the building. It was the Campbell Heights Apartments, and it now has gone back to the Paul Laurence Dunbar Apartments. But Greg started playing guitar at the age of 8, and he was serving papers at the Paul Laurence Dunbar Hotel. And he played all over U Street and ended up playing with the Manhattans. You may not be familiar with them, but they came out of Jersey City. And then he played with Elvis Presley. He conducted their orchestra and played guitar for him. So he has quite a rich history. And not only him, there are so many musicians, great musicians that come out of Washington, D.C. that I'm so proud of. But once again, let me go back and tell you how proud I am to have had a part in reading that book and how wonderful it made me feel. It was one of those things that didn't depress me once I had read it. When I read it, I felt real good about the fact that I had talked to a white man about my history. So, having said that, thank you all so much, and do have a good read.
Sure.
Don't go away, the musicians are coming.
Yes, Rusty Hassan, some of you, Chad, will recognize the voice. We'll be interviewing the busboys and
know, we only have time for, I think, one song, so I figured I'd do something that would be reminiscent of the U Street. Oh, you figured it out. I see trees of green and red roses too. I see them blue for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yeah. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, those bright blessed days and the dark sacred nights. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Oh, the colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, they're also on the faces of people walking by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're also saying, I love you. I hear babies crying, and I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. I think to myself, thank God Almighty for all those wonderful years on U Street. Thank God in heaven for jazz. Skibbity-bop, dibbity-bop, boop-boop-doop-doop-doop-doop-bop. Thank God for this wonderful country, and you all voted, right? God bless America. All that together makes this a wonderful world. Oh, yeah. God bless y'all. Ha-cha-cha-cha-cha. We thank you so much. We pray that the next entertainer you see will have the pleasure of an audience as wonderful as you've been today. Thank you so much.